Good morning. Good morning. We will get started in just 1 minute. It's almost 10 o'clock. So welcome to those of you who are trickling in. All right, so let's get going. It's okay if some other people join us. My name is Harmony. I work with the Fix It Fair, and we are so excited to be here today with Dennis, our master gardener, who is going to lay all of his knowledge on us. Just a few little housekeeping things before we get started. We are doing this on Zoom and also streaming to Facebook Live, and we love questions and comments. So I just want to run through a quick how-to to do those things. If you have any questions anytime throughout the presentation, down at the bottom of your screen, if you're with us on Zoom, there's a little Q&A function and a little chat function. Both of those will get to us, and we'll be monitoring those throughout the presentation. So just feel free to drop your questions in there at any time. And when Dennis gets to a good point to answer them, we will do that and definitely get to them by the end. Facebook, if you're joining us, you can just drop those questions in the comments, and I'll be monitoring that on the back end, so then I can bring those into the presentation as well. So without further ado, Dennis, I'd like to welcome you. Thanks for joining us this morning, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Harmony. I'm going to share my screen and get started here. Welcome, everyone. There we go. Whoops. I need to get back to the beginning. There we are. So everyone should now see Garden of Eatin, Vegetable Gardening and Spring Starting Tips for Spring. This is a talk for the Fix It Fair. My name is Dennis Brown. I am an Oregon State University Master Gardener volunteer. I grew up on a farm in Iowa, and my parents had a small home orchard and garden. And I grew up gardening with my parents and my grandparents. And I also have academic degrees in horticulture and plant biology. And I've been a master gardener since 2010 in Oregon and elsewhere. The Oregon State University Master Gardener Extension Service Master Gardener Program educates Oregonians about the art and science of growing and caring for plants. Master gardeners are volunteer educators, neighbors, and on-the-ground researchers. We serve our community with solid training in science-based sustainable gardening and a lifelong love of learning. Let me know if you have any questions about the Master Gardener Program, and we'll also have a Q&A session, a live Q&A session at the end of this talk to answer questions about the topic today, as well as Harmony mentioned, you can post things in the chat and the Q&A. One other thing I'd like to do is a land acknowledgement. The Portland metro area rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. People from these lands are now part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, many of whom maintain a connection to their ancestral homelands and continue their traditional cultural practices. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank the original caretakers of this land, and I encourage you to think about the history of the land on which you live and grow your food, and how you came to be here and the people who preceded you on that land, and the historical events that led up to where we are today. And with that, I'd like to start my talk about getting your garden ready to grow for spring. I have a number of topics I'd like to cover today listed here. Selecting the right location, testing and amending the soil for pH and nutrients, developing a planting plan, both for this year and on maybe successional planting throughout the entire year, and then some very specific seed planting and transplant planting information on getting plants in the ground. So I have a number of topics there that we'll end with. So let's get things kicked off here with site selection. So that's probably one of the most important things, is getting the best site you possibly can for your garden. And I have a whole list here on the left-hand side of characteristics that you want to have in your garden. And we have constraints in our yards. We can't always get everything that we want. So get as many of those as you can. A good sun exposure would be high on my list. Getting a well-drained soil. You may have to make some amendments to your soil if you have a lot of clay, like adding some organic matter, or if it's really sandy, adding organic matter to help hold water. So you may have to make some amendments. Try to avoid conflicts with trees and other landscaping because they compete with your garden for water and for nutrients, and also try to have a source of nutrients, or source of water nearby. This picture on the right-hand side is my community garden that I used to have, and it doesn't look like much, but it has all the right characteristics. It's got lots of sun exposure, it's nice flat, it's got water nearby, so it's got a lot of the positive characteristics one wants to have. And with all those characteristics, you can have a pretty good looking garden. And this is my garden towards the end of the summer. Most things are mature. You see some pole beans in the background, and there are tomatoes in the foreground. And there are even some fall crops that are starting to pop up here in the foreground. There's some peas that I grow. I start them in the late summer, and then I harvest them in the early fall. So site selection is a very important component of your garden, and try to get the best site you can to get your garden off to a good start. I want to talk a little bit about the soil, because the soil is the foundation of your garden, and the plants growing in it, that's where they get their nutrients, where they get their water. So it's really good to have, it's important to have a really good soil. And one way to tell if your soil has nutrients in it and has the right pH to optimize growth for your plants is to take a soil sample and have it tested. The soil sample will tell you what your soil needs to help your crop grow, and it provides information on the capacity of your soil to supply nutrients and helps you select the correct fertilizer and liming materials, because I will talk about liming materials here a little bit, in order to optimize the growth in your garden. So I'm going to kick things off here with a video that shows you how to collect a soil sample. In all my videos, I have 3 or 4 of these embedded in my presentation, and all of them have a list of materials that you need to conduct the work that I'm describing on the left-hand side, and then the video on the right-hand side. So let's look at how to collect a representative soil sample from your garden.
I'm here to demonstrate how to take a representative soil sample from your vegetable garden. I've assembled the things I need to collect the sample, and that includes a large mixing bowl like you might have in your kitchen. It can be stainless steel or glass or Tupperware. You'll need something to get the sample out of the soil. I like to use a Hori knife. You could also use a trowel. You'll need a container of some sort to put the sample in to send it to the laboratory, something with a lid that fits tightly. And it's also good to have a marking pen of some sort, like the Sharpie, to write an identifier on your sample, just in case you're taking a sample from more than one location in your yard. So here's the place where I'm going to take my sample, and I'm actually going to take a sample from 3 different locations in my yard to mix together to make a composite. That way the sample is representative of the soil in my garden and not just of one location where I take one sample. So here where I'm going to take this sample, if there's any mulch or other covering on top of the ground, I move that to the side with my hand, and then I dig a hole about 6 inches deep, 6 to 8 inches deep, which is the depth of the root zone for plants. So once I have the hole dug, I take the Hori knife and I slip it down about 1 inch behind the wall of the hole. And then I tip the Hori knife back so that I get a profile of the soil from the bottom of the hole to the top of the hole. And so that way I get both a vertical representative sample as well as a spatial representative sample by taking the sample from various locations. Then I take that sample and I put it in the mixing bowl. And you notice that there was soil in the mixing bowl before. That's because I'd already sampled in another location. So when you get your samples all together, you put it in the bowl and mix it really well. And then you can put it in your sample container, like so. So that's how you take a representative sample from your vegetable garden. Next, we're going to talk about analyzing the sample by sending it to a laboratory, or you could do the sample testing at home yourself.
And you saw me fill up that container. You want to check with the laboratory that you're sending your sample to make sure you provide them with enough soil sample. The laboratory I was sending it to historically needed about 1 or 2 cups of soil. They've now told me they want 3, which is a little bit more. So you want to make sure you're sending them the appropriate amount of soil so that they can run the sample. So we talked about collecting the sample from multiple locations. You collect it from the root zone, which for vegetable crops is fairly shallow. Certainly some roots go down deeper than 8 inches, but a lot of the nutrients and a lot of the the nutrition that the plant gets comes from those top 6 to 8 inches of soil. So that's what we're primarily sampling. The analysis that you'd want to run are certainly macronutrients, what we call the macronutrients of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. pH is also a good thing, especially here in the Pacific Northwest. That tells you how acid the soil is, because you'll probably want to adjust the pH of your soil a little bit to optimize production. It's good to see how much organic matter is in your soil, because that affects water holding capacity and also provides nutrients. And then if you really want to take a deep dive into your soil, you can measure micronutrients, things like boron and other compounds, manganese, but those aren't as important as the macronutrients. So once you've got your sample collected, you can either send it to a laboratory or you can do some home testing. And there's some limited options for home testing, which I'll talk about. But for a lab, it's really great because you'll get really accurate results. And this is a form that typical form that you send to a laboratory. You give them the information, your contact information, what tests you want to run. They should ask you what crops you're going to grow, because that affects their recommendations. And you should always ask if they have the option of giving recommendations that you do in fact want recommendations from them. You can see here, and there's a green band in the middle of this form that says check box if recommendations is required. So definitely check that. And if they have an option of pounds per 1,000 square feet, that's probably a better option for you to check than pounds per acre. Most people garden in maybe a few hundred square feet in their yard, not on acres. So that's a couple things to keep in mind. It provides very specific recommendations, and it takes about 2 weeks to get results. You can do home testing, especially for pH. This is pretty good. There's a pretty good test kit for pH. There is a test kit for macronutrients. It's not as good. I don't think it's as good as, certainly not as good as a laboratory test. It's a little hard to interpret. But there is a home test kit for pH. It's lower accuracy. You're trying to discern a difference in color. You add your soil sample in here, and I have a video that shows this. Add some reagent and some water, mix it all together, and then you get a color change, and you match the color of your solution against this scale to determine what the pH is. So there's some challenges there to determine exactly what the color is and what your pH is, but it's actually an okay way to do it, because there's some rules of thumb that I'll give you for the amount of lime to add if your soil is too acidic, which is likely to be the case here in the Pacific Northwest if you haven't amended the soil for pH in the past. Of course, you don't get any recommendations, but the results are immediate. You can take your sample, put it in there, shake it up, and within 10 minutes have the results. So a little difference between home and lab testing. So I want to talk first about testing the soil and amending it for pH. pH is the acidity versus the alkalinity or basicity of the soil. And our Pacific Northwest soils west of the Cascades are mildly acidic. They tend to be between 5.5 to 5.8 in the pH range. And if you recall from your high school biology or chemistry class, pH is a scale of 0 to 14, with 7 being neutral, pure water. Below 7 is acidic, above 7 is basic or alkaline. So our pHs here are slightly acidic, and most vegetable crops prefer a pH of around 6 to 7.5. So really the sweet spot would be maybe 6.5 to 7. So most gardens are going to need a little bit of lime in order to optimize that. And you can certainly grow crops at the lower pH. They'll do okay, but they might do better if you raise the pH a little bit. There are also some pest issues that are alleviated if you raise some soil-borne diseases that are reduced if you actually grow at a higher pH for crops like broccoli and kale and that particular plant group. So raising the pH will do a number of positive things for your soil. It neutralizes soil acidity, which raises the pH. It supplies calcium if you use calcitic lime, agricultural lime. Most products contain calcium. If you use a product called dolomitic lime, it will also supply some magnesium. Adding lime promotes root growth. It's excellent for creating a good environment for soil organisms that break down organic matter and release nutrients. It helps improve the soil structure. It helps, if you have a clay soil and a sandy soil, it helps aggregate soil particles together along with organic matter to make larger particles, which open up the pore space and create air and channels for air and water to move through the soil. So it's really good. And as I mentioned, it reduces the damage for some soil-borne pathogens for plants, particularly in the mustard family, like Chinese greens, kale, broccoli, and cabbage. So it's getting the pH up a little higher, around 7, reduces the incidence of that disease. It's a disease called clubroot. And here I am just spreading some lime by hand on my garden. So if you send a sample to the laboratory, this is typical of the lab results that you'll get back. And there's a lot of information on here, and I'm going to highlight a couple things. But the top half of this form are the results. And I asked for a complete analysis here. So I've got results for nutrients as well as for pH and a lot of other things like organic matter. But I'm focusing on pH in this particular part of the presentation, and the bottom half are recommendations. So below it, it gives you some recommendations to implement to address the issues that you've asked for recommendations. So in this particular lab result, this was my garden before I did anything to amend the soil. And you can see that the pH of my garden falls right into that range of 5.5 to 5.8. The pH of my garden soil was 5.8. And the laboratory made a recommendation to me that I should add 140 pounds of 100 score lime per 1,000 square feet. So there's a couple things here. I want to talk about how we did the calculations. Or how I did the calculations. So the lab is recommending 100 score lime, and that's a factor that's used by the state of Oregon, was implemented by the state of Oregon, that sort of standardizes the various lime products that are out there. 100 score lime is sort of their standard. And some lime products have a higher number and some lime products have a lower number, and there's not too much difference between them other than you may have to add more or less, and some of them release things a little faster than others. But I went to a store, a nursery, and found this particular product. It's pictured here on the left-hand side, and it says it has a Oregon lime score of 90. And what that means is it's just not quite as effective as the standard that they're recommending in the soil test. So in order to get the same result, I'm going to have to add a little bit more. It's only 90% as effective as the standard that's being recommended in the test. So I'm going to have to add a little bit more than 140 pounds to my lab or to my garden. And my garden is 200 square feet rather than 1,000 square feet. So I need to take that into account as well when figuring out how much to add. So here are the calculations sort of laid out. The recommendation is 140. I divide by 0.9 because I'm going to need a little bit more of that product than the standard of 100 score. So I'm going to need 156 pounds per 1,000 square feet. But my garden is only 200 square feet, so I adjust for that. And I would need to apply 32 pounds per 200 square feet of my garden to raise that pH to about from 5.8 to about 6.5. And you can do similar calculations based on lab results that you get if you have your garden tested for pH. You can also use a home test kit. And I'm going to show you in the next video how to use that test kit and then talk about a rule of thumb you can use to adjust the pH, since you're not going to get any recommendations from it, to adjust the pH based on the results that you get. So let's take a look at that video and how a home pH test is done.
I've got two home pH test kits laid out here. One is unopened, and then the other one I've opened up and laid the components out across the table. So the test kit consists of a card which gives you information about how to perform the test and also the optimum pH for various vegetable crops. Inside the kit, the main component is a mixing chamber with a lid, a capsule of pH reagent, and an eyedropper for adding water to your soil and pH reagent mixture. Now I'm going to demonstrate how to actually take the measurement. So I open up my container and I take a small pinch of soil, and if you look closely on the bottom of the container, you can see that there's a dotted line, and I'm going to fill that container up to that dotted line with soil from my sample. Tap, tap, tap. That looks about right. Now I'm going to set this down and open up the capsule that contains the pH reagent. And this is always a little bit tricky. Sometimes the top sticks. I've pre-loosened it to make it a little bit easier. And inside is the white powder, which is going to cause the reaction and give the color change to tell us the pH. So now I take my eyedropper, and if you look closely, there's a second line at the top of the chamber. This is the fill line for the water. So I'm going to add some water to that till I get up to the fill line. 2 or 3 eyedroppers does it. I think about 3 maybe. Partway there. Yeah, 3 eyedroppers. Then I take the lid, put it back on the mixing chamber, and shake. And usually I do this for about 15 or 30 seconds. Take a look at it, make sure everything is getting mixed up really well. And now we have to wait about 10 minutes for the soil and sediment that's in the mixing container to settle to the bottom so that we can see the color change.
And because I did this previously, we don't have to wait 10 minutes to see the results, but I have some results here in the photograph on the left-hand side. And these results were actually taken from 2 different parts of my yard. And you'll notice a slight difference in color. And of course, you can see how it's somewhat difficult to tell the difference in color. But you can see that the one on the left is slightly more acid than the one on the right. And that's because the one on the left, the sample that was taken on the left, was taken from under my blueberries, where I have treated the soil to reduce the pH, to increase the acidity and reduce the pH, because blueberries and a few other crops like a more acid soil than we have, and I've been kind of reducing that, and I've got that pH down. It's still probably in the 5.5 to 6.0 range. I hadn't done too much adjustment yet when I had took this sample, but you can see in the right-hand sample that the color is much greener, and it's probably somewhere in the range of 6.5 to 7. It's sort of this dark green color, and that's because this sample was taken from my garden after I had lined the garden for a couple years and gotten the pH up to where I wanted to be. So that gives you an idea of what the color change looks like and how you what would you would have to do to discern the color difference between different samples. So just kind of, because people always ask what the costs are, and these are approximate costs. It varies from laboratory to laboratory. If you're doing pH only, it might be about $12 to $15, I would say, plus whatever shipping costs would. If you do pH, macronutrients, and organic matter, it might be $15 to $20. Or so. And then if you did everything above plus micronutrients, it gets more expensive, at maybe $35 or so. Home testing kits, on the other hand, you can get 10 kits. One of those kits that I showed you comes with 10 capsules. So you get 10 test kits, 10 tests in one kit for $7. There are also test kits for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium and pH combined, and those are $8. I don't recommend those. They're a little more difficult to interpret than the pH test kit, which is pretty straightforward, I think. So I also mentioned that I was going to give you a rule of thumb. Let's say you're for applying lime. So let's say your pH was around 6, like mine was 5.86. So OSU recommends that to raise the pH 1/2 unit from say 6 to 6.5, that you can add 10 pounds of 100 score lime per 100 square feet of garden. So if you add 10 pounds of 100 score lime per 100 square feet of garden, that will raise your pH about 1/2 of a unit. So if you have 6, it'll raise it to about 6.5. And that number will vary because of soil factors such as how much organic matter you have, whether you have a sandy soil or a clay soil, how much buffering capacity is. But that's kind of a rule of thumb. And what you can do is add that amount, see what the pH change is, and if you need to add more, then come back in and add more, a second thing to raise it up, a second application to raise it a little bit more the following year. So you can do it in sort of increments, and that recommendation comes from an OSU extension publication on vegetable gardening in Oregon. So one of the things I want to talk about today also is developing a planting plan. Now, you can grow your garden just to have seasonal production, where you have a rest period during the winter, or you can do it with a succession of plants that take you all year round. And I like to do year-round gardening. But when you do that, you have to take into account the days to maturity, which is often on the seed packet, a certain amount of time to harvest, and then when you can start your next crop. So when you're planting a garden, you need to kind of take those things into account. This is a picture on the left-hand side of my vegetable garden. It's a different plot at a community garden a few years ago. And you can see in the background that there are sweet corn, and then there are some pole beans behind that. And this is in August, so the sweet corn has just wrapped up, I think, or there might be 1 or 2 years left on there, and the beans will be coming out in a little while as well. One thing I want to point out about this too is that you're looking north as you're looking at this garden. So I have the shorter things in my garden planted on the south side and the taller things planted on the north side, so that my taller plants don't shade my shorter plants. But what I really want to show you is the succession planting here. This is August, and this next slide is November. It's the same plot. You're actually looking south now instead of north, but the beans have been replaced with lettuces when they came out, and the corn was replaced with some broadcast mustard. So I just broadcast some mustard seeds in where the corn used to be. That, and mustards include things like arugula, mizuna, red-leaved mustard. It's kind of a mix of things, and I let those grow during the winter. And when they're young, I have microgreens or mini greens, and then as they mature, I get big. I thin them out, and I get bigger leaved plants. So in November, I often plant lettuces so that I have a fall crop that comes out sometime around Thanksgiving or as late as Christmas. I've harvested some of my lettuces around Christmas time too. So think about that when you're developing a plan, whether you want to have just a summer crop, which is fine, and maybe put your garden to bed during the winter, or whether you want to have a succession of plantings all year round. I'm a big proponent of fall and winter gardening myself. So here's a typical planting plan that I had one year. A few years ago, I started with snow peas and shelling peas in my garden in March. They can be planted usually starting in mid-March, and you harvest them in late May, early June. Then you have a little break period, and you can subsequently plant some summer crops, some basil, some chard, some turnips get in there. And I follow those up in the fall again. I planted some leeks in September. Now the leeks I actually started in a pot as seeds in July, and then I transplanted them as small starts into the garden in early September. So I didn't seed the leeks in September. I seeded them back in July and then transplanted them into the garden in September. The mustards I planted directly and had mustard greens all through the winter. And of course, the chard and leeks continued on into the winter as well. I have chard. Usually I take my chard out. I still have some in my garden this year, but I'll be taking it out in the next week or two. And then leeks will come out in, I harvested some last week, and I will harvest some on into April. And then you can follow that up. You'll have a little break period again to put some amendments on your soil, get your garden ready for summer. You can plant your summer crops of sweet corn and pole beans, and then repeat the cycle with winter crops again, and keep your garden going all year round. Another thing you want to think about in developing a planting plan is crop rotation. You don't want to grow the same crop in the same spot every year. Maybe section your garden off into individual sections or plots where you rotate crops in and out. And part of that is because there are soil-borne diseases that persist from year to year. And if you grow tomatoes, for example, in the same place year after year, over time, those disease organisms can build up and limit the production of your crop. So, maybe tomatoes up here in the upper left-hand corner one year, moving them where the buckwheat and phacelia cover crop is the next year, then moving them down into one of these other plots the subsequent year, and just kind of rotate things around so you're not always planting the same crop in the same place. It's also good for a nutrient basis because you might be planting peas and beans in some cases, which actually can add nitrogen back to the soil, while other things will deplete nitrogen from the soil. By rotating crops around that add nitrogen versus deplete nitrogen, you can also help with the nitrogen balance in your soil. So keep that in mind when you're developing a planting plan. Now I want to end the talk with a number of techniques for seed starting, direct seeding, pre-sprouting seeds, and growing transplants. So I have a picture here on the left-hand side of some pre-sprouted seeds. Pre-sprouting is a good technique. If you have some old seeds that you're not sure how well they're going to grow and they're conducive to transplanting, you can, like these chard plants are, you can take 2 damp pieces of paper towel, sprinkle the seeds in between the paper towels, and then slip them into a plastic bag and hold them at room temperature and see which ones germinate. And it's useful. This seed packet actually had a lot of older seed in it, so I wasn't sure how well it was going to germinate. So I didn't want to take up the resources of potting up plants for transplant or for direct seeding and then have not very many things come up. So I pre-sprouted the seed between damp paper towels for a few days, saw which ones were germinated, and you can see here, if you look closely, there's just little tiny bits of white root coming out. These are ready, those that are germinating are ready to transplant, or ready to move to the garden to plant. You don't want to damage that root when you plant it, so smaller is probably better than bigger. But that way, you're not planting a lot of seed that's not viable, especially if you have an older packet of seed. So I want to talk a little bit about another technique, seed tape, that makes planting fast and easy. Seed tape are seeds that are embedded in paper tape, and you can get it commercially. In the photograph, you can see there's some commercial seed tape here that you can buy, but you can also make it yourself. And this next video shows you how to make seed tape yourself. It's particularly useful for small seeded crops. And I'm going to run this video and you can see how it's done.
I have 2 examples of seed tape here that I want to show you. One is commercially available seed tape that you can get from many seed companies. And the other is a piece of seed tape that I made myself last year. And the total length of this, it's folded up now, is about 5 feet. And that's a good length for your garden to set out a row of seeds in your garden. So I have laid out in front of me all the things I need to make seed tape at home. And for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to do a shorter piece today and show you how that's done. So I've taken a roll of toilet paper and I've cut it vertically into strips. And that's what I have laid out here on the table, about a 1-inch wide strip that's about a foot long in this case. And I'm going to use radish seeds to make my seed tape. The first thing I do is I lightly spritz the toilet paper with water. Just dampen it a little bit. toilet paper is designed to dissolve, so you don't want to get it too wet or it'll completely dissolve. So I have my radish seeds, and on the back it says to space them about 2 inches apart. So I've poured some out into this bowl, and I'm going to use some tweezers to place them onto the dampened toilet paper at about the distance that they specify. And so I have a ruler laid out there so you can see that. So I'm going to drop a seed about every 2 inches or so. There we go. And I'm going to probably put about 5 or 6 down here. And when I get to the end, I'm going to stop a little bit before the end, because you may not have noticed it on my homemade seed tape, but on the end, I write the name of the seed. So if I have a whole bunch of different seeds, I'll know which seed tape is which. Then, to actually set the seeds in place, I take a little kitchen spatula and fold the toilet paper over on top of the seed, just like this. There we go. I kind of pat that down a little bit to make it all stick together. And then I do it from the other side and fold it over the top again, just like that. There we go. And it doesn't have to be pretty. It'll all dry together. And then the end, I kind of fold a little bit by hand, just like this, to kind of flatten it. Oops, got kind of messy. But that's okay, it's fine. And then I give it one more pat to make sure it's all stuck together nicely. Pat, 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 a couple times. And then you could lift it off, carefully lift it off the counter to move it to another location to dry so that you can do another piece. And here's a little trick. If in fact you've accidentally wet the paper too much, you can use a hair dryer and just gently dry the tape a little bit before you move it. I'm going to pick this up. Mine is actually pretty good shape. There it is. That's seed tape. You just let that dry on the counter, and then next spring you can take it outside and plant it in your garden.
And seed tape is a great thing to do in the late winter when it's raining outside and it's cold, or maybe it was snowing. It's a little extra work up front, but it makes planting in your garden a lot faster. You can make about 5 or 6 foot long strips of seed tape, and then you just make a little trench to the appropriate depth, lay down your seed tape, cover it up, and you're ready to go. So regardless of whether you're using seed tape or you're doing direct seeding in your garden, one important thing to keep in mind is that temperature greatly affects how quickly and how well seeds germinate. So plant based on soil temperature. If it's too cool, you'll get slow germination, a slow percent germination, seeds will rot, and then if seeds do start to germinate, they may not have many nutrients. Now, most seed calendars unfortunately don't give you the temperature so much, but they give you a date. I find that generally the coldest season crops here in where I live in Portland in the North Willamette Valley, that I can plant things that require at least 45 degrees by mid-March, sometime around mid-March. Maybe a little earlier for things that are a little more tolerant of colder soils like peas and cabbage, but really mid-March is about the best time to do it. I went out this morning with my soil thermometer. You see a picture of a soil thermometer here on the left-hand side. I used that same soil thermometer this morning to measure my soil temperature, and it's 38 degrees. So it's still a little too cool to plant anything in my garden here on, I think it's, what is it, the 5th? Yes, the 5th of March today. So maybe wait another week or 10 days before planting those earliest season crops. And of course, the summer crops you don't want to plant until the soil is really warm at 65 degrees or so. Interestingly, I have access to another garden that has much sandier soil, and this is usually typical of sandy soil. We don't have too many of those in Portland, but there are a few areas that have really sandy soil here in Portland. And that soil tends to warm up more quickly because it has a lower water holding capacity, and they tend to heat up faster. So I took a thermometer out to that garden this week, and I found that the temperature there was surprisingly 50 degrees already. So you may be able to plant earlier if you have a sandy soil. You'll probably have to plant a little later if you have a really heavy clay soil that retains water, because those soils will stay cool longer. There's some great, one of the references that I give at the end of this talk, which is a publication called Growing Your Own, which is produced by Oregon State University for home vegetable gardening. It has a great table in it that talks about when to plant various crops based on the calendar date for the different climate zones of Oregon, like the coastal area, Eastern Oregon, and the North Willamette Valley, where we are. So I highly recommend checking out one of those publications to see if you're planting at the right time. I now want to turn to transplants. I really like to grow transplants. It helps you extend the growing seasons. I have seeds started in my garage right now that I'm going to be transplanting in mid-March. They give you better weed control because you're starting with you can clear your garden and you're starting with a plant that's 2 or 3 inches tall, so you get a jump on weeds when you're planting. You can avoid conflicts with other crops, especially at the end of the growing season in the late summer, your summer growing season. You may still have things in your garden and you want to get things started for fall. You can plant some seeds for transplant in, say, late July or early August, and when your summer crops come out at the end of August or beginning in September, those you'll have starts. They're maybe 2 or 3 inches tall that you can then plant in your garden and will be ready to grow. Start growing right away. It also is great because it gives you, starting your own seeds, gives you a wider choice of cultivars than you might have available if you just went down to your garden center, and also have starts available at times of the year when you wouldn't normally get them from a garden center. So transplants are a great way to get a start, and you can do it at home fairly easily. I have a little video here of how to do it. I have a setup in my garage, and I'm going to explain how that works in this next video.
This is the transplant area I've set up in my garage. I want to show you some of the components that we've used to create it. First, there are 2 shelves. These were purchased at a big box store. Suspended from the upper shelf is a 4-foot length of shop work light. It has LED lamps in it. You could also use fluorescent. It's suspended from the top shelf with a chain link. Another important component of the system is this heating pad. And the heating pad is a propagation mat that keeps the temperature in the root zone about 10 to 20 degrees above ambient, which is really important for me because I have this set up in my unheated garage. And in February, my garage is about 40 degrees, 45 degrees. And this keeps the temperature in the root zone at about 50 to 55 degrees. Now I want to show you some of the control systems for the light and for the heating pad. So the light is connected to this timer. It's kind of a Christmas tree timer, or a timer you might use on a lamp. And right now it's set at 13 hours of light and 11 hours of darkness. Over here we have the controller for the heat pad. And it's actually set at 70 degrees, although right now it's reading 67.8. And it works like the thermostat on your furnace. And it keeps the temperature at about 70 degrees, but sometimes it's a little higher and sometimes it's a little lower. It senses that temperature with this probe that you put in the soil where you're growing your plants. Now I'm going to put some of the plants that I've been growing up on the shelf so you can see how it all kind of fits together. These are plants that I started, about maybe 10 or 15 days ago. It's some kale, it's some lettuces, it's some Chinese greens. And because they're relatively short plants, I have the light very close to them. I have the light fixture all the way down to the bottom of these chains from which the lamp is suspended. Now here, I pointed out earlier that I have some tomato plants actually growing. It's some seeds that I planted just a few days ago. And by the time they're ready to leave this area, they could be 5 to 6 inches tall. And so one of the nice things about having a chain is that you can raise the light as the tomato plants grow. So by the end of the time when the tomato plants are on this heating pad, The chain will be about half the length that it is now. So there'll be plenty of room for my plants to grow. One other component I'd like to show you is this insulated pad that I have underneath the heating pad. And it helps retain some of the heat. You could also use cardboard, or you could use a sheet of plywood. In addition to help retain heat, I've added some bubble wrap around the outside. And that helps, especially in the colder days, to keep some of the heat inside where the plants are actually growing. So with this system, you can get a couple weeks head start on spring with your plants. I often start plants around the 1st of February, my cold season things like bok choy and kale and some lettuces, and then I transplant them about the 15th of March. My tomatoes, I start about the 1st of April, and they'll be ready to go in the ground under this system about the 10th or 15th of May. So with that, that's how you can get a jump on spring by growing transplants in your own garage.
Just to highlight a couple of the bigger components, lighting and heat. I use a 4-foot fixture with 2 cool white LED lamps. You can buy more expensive grow lights, but for the purposes of just growing transplants, you can go with the more widely available and probably less expensive, although the prices are changing on all these things over time as we evolve and move to LEDs. A cool white lamp will work just fine. It provides the right kind of light for early plant growth. And then the heat source is a 60-watt propagation heating pad with a temperature controller and a thermometer. And the cost of all of this together is about $120. The light fixture was about $24. The timer was maybe 10 or so. And then the heating pad and controller is the most expensive component at about $65. If you have a place in your basement that's warm enough, you could just have it without the heating pad. It's nice to have the heating pad because the plants really respond to that heat in the root zone. So I'd like to wrap up with one more how to make low-cost transplant pots. You can make them from widely available materials that are available to you, and you can plant seeds in them. You can make paper pots and grow transplants rather than buying the little plastic containers, 6-packs that they sell in stores. This is a great way to do it. And this next video will show you how to do that.
I'm going to use some materials that most of us have around the house to create little transplant pots rather than using the 6-packs, which you have to buy in a store. And the materials that I'm using are a soda can, a relatively small diameter, a sauce can, like a tomato sauce can might work as well, as that will be our mold. A plastic container, you can get salad in these, or this happened to be an Aussie Bite container from Costco that will hold the small transplant pots that we're going to make. Some newspaper, this happens to be the New York Times Book Review, but the Willamette Weekly or another local newspaper would work equally well. I have seeds and some labeling material, and I have some soil, some potting soil that I bought. So let's take a look at how we actually do this. So the first thing you do is you take one sheet of newspaper and you hold it by the binding, the edge, and you can tear it easily into thirds, which is about the right size for your pots. And you want to tear it starting at the fold because of the way newspaper is made. It'll tear in a nice straight section that way. So then you open up the piece of newspaper and put it on your mold. And I like to do it about, maybe a couple inches up. And then I turn the can and roll the newspaper over. Roll, 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 roll. Till it's all on. Then I grasp it and I fold in the bottom, starting where the seam is. And fold that in really tight, and I push it with my fist in the palm of my hand. And also, to really make it flat, I put it on the table and give it a couple of turns. Then I remove the newspaper from the mold, like so, carefully and slowly. And there's your pot. So the next step, the pots are going to go into this container. Here's some that I've pre-filled with soil, just to show you how it looks. And now I'm going to fill this container with soil. And here's a little trick for filling your containers. So what I've done is I've just filled it completely full to the top, maybe a little bit over. And rather than pushing the soil down with my fingers, I tap it on the bottom. Tap, 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 tap. Tap, 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 tap a few times. And you can see what happens is the soil naturally settles to about 1/4 inch below the top of the container. Now I'm ready to plant. So I have my chard seed laid out here. I take one of my seeds, and it said that the planting depth was 1/2 inch, so I've laid that on top of the soil, and then I have a little toothpick probe that I push the seed down with to about the 1/2 inch depth that I want. Cover that with soil, but I'm not quite done yet. I want to label it, so in case I plant more than one thing in this container, more than one plant, I can write on the side. That's one nice thing about having newspaper, is you can write right on the side what is in each container. And I've used a Sharpie in this case, but you could also just use a pencil. And then you put it in your container with the rest of your pots that have already been planted. And then you can add water. And you're ready to grow transplants.
And just a couple of comments about the paper pots. You do want to be careful not to overwater the pots so that there's water standing. If you have a plastic container without any holes in the bottom, that you don't have water standing in the bottom because they can get too wet. You want to have good air circulation around them as well. Two things, you can now, when you get ready to put these in the garden, you can just plant the entire pot in the ground. You don't have to remove the plant out of the pot. The paper is biodegradable. And the only thing you need to do when you plant is, you can see right now there's a little bit of a lip on the top of the pot that extends above the soil. You want to remove that lip so that that paper doesn't act as a wick and draw water up from the rest of the pot and cause a little dry zone around where the plant roots are trying to get through the pot. And the plant roots will get through the pot. People always worry about, oh, if I just plant it, won't the roots just grow in the pot? I actually find that even when they're growing together like this, still under lights in my house, where the pots touch, sometimes the roots will go through one pot and into the other pot. The paper is very permeable. Roots have no problem going through the pots. And I don't think I've included in this presentation, but I actually have photographed, like I start corn this way and the corn roots go right through it. And there's a little residual paper left at the end of the year, but you can see that the corn roots have very quickly went right through the pot. So just a couple of comments about the pots. You can pot directly in them. Just remove that little lip and they're ready to go. So that wraps up my talk today about getting your garden ready to grow for spring. We talked a little bit about selecting the right location. I gave you some parameters for that. And you don't necessarily have to have all of them, but try to select as many as you can, especially getting as much sun as you can, 8 to 10 hours of sun, really 10 hours minimum of sun. If you have less than that, if you have less sun, you might want to focus on things that are more you're eating for the foliage, like lettuces and things. You'll need more sun for crops that are producing fruit, like tomatoes or peppers and eggplants and sweet corn. But some of the green crop, the greens that you grow will do better, will do okay. They'll do better with full sun, but they'll do okay if you have less sun. And avoid competition with other plants. We talked a little about testing and amending the soil for pH. We talked about sampling for nutrients. Developing a planting plan. You can do it for just the summer, or you can plan for the whole year, and you can just plant one crop after the other with only leaving a brief period of time in between, or planting cover crops perhaps in between. And then we talked about direct planting, like direct seeding or planting with seed tape, and then growing transplants. So I hope you found this talk interesting and useful. Here are some resources. This presentation is going to be available on the Fix-It Fair website as the video. I also will be making a PDF file of this presentation, so you can get a hard copy of that as well. That will be posted with the video. And it has a list of these resources. Growing Your Own was one publication I referenced already. There are a number of other ones on here. Many people ask, where can you send samples to get them analyzed? There is a publication from OSU that lists analytical laboratories serving Oregon. You can check that for laboratories. I am an OSU Master Gardener in the metro area, and you can find the Metro Master Gardeners on the web at metromastergardeners.org. You can follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. And I'll take any questions that you have now, but I'll also leave you with this slide that shows the website for metromastergardeners.org. On that website is a form that you can submit with your question, and it will get to a Master Gardeners, and we try to get back to you within 48 hours with some sort of response, either that we're working on it or we have the answer for you. So if there are questions that you have today that I'm unable to answer or we don't have time for, you can go to www.metromastergardeners.org and submit your question online. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll take some questions.
Thanks, Dennis. This is Harmony. We have a couple questions in the Q&A that I just want to make sure we get answered. The first one is, if a garden has many raised beds, do we need to collect samples from each of the raised beds for soil testing?
That's a good question. And it sort of depends. If the raised beds have a similar origin, like they were all filled at the same time with the same type of material, and you've been cropping similar things on them, vegetable gardens, maybe rotating your crops, then you could do a composite sample for all of them to represent all of them. On the other hand, if you have different materials in them and you're not sure of the history of the individual ones, or one you've been using continuously for sweet corn and tomatoes, things that really are heavy feeders, and the other ones you have things that are lighter feeders, then you may want to take samples from different ones. If you have a reason to believe that the history of the planters is different, so then you might want to take a couple of different samples, one from each one. But if you kind of think that they've all been managed the same way, they all have the same origin, they're the same age, then you could probably just take one sample from, a composite sample from all three and adjust them. Depends on how far you want to dive down into it.
Perfect. And then we have one that says, how fast can you see results of lime added after, like in a pH test, after you add the lime?
Oh, after you add the lime? It usually takes a few months because the lime takes a while to dissolve. So the ideal time to lime your soil is in the fall. So if you you can do that. You take a sample in the fall and add lime, and it has over winter. The rains come. The lime doesn't move very quickly in your soil. Some nutrients get leached away, but lime doesn't act that way. It tends to stick around and not move very far. It doesn't permeate very far in the soil and leach away. So fall is the best time. Now is an okay time too. I wouldn't do it when the crops are actively growing. It's just harder to do it and get it mixed in. But it takes usually a couple months for you to see an effect as the lime slowly dissolves. Some lime products dissolve faster than others. The 100 score lime, which is calcium carbonate, is sort of a moderate, not a real fast change. Some things that are a little higher might contain some calcium oxides that are more reactive and adjust the pH faster. But you don't want things to be too hot, too high of a lime score. So I'd say a couple months is a good answer for that.
Thank you. And I know I'm kind of skipping in the order of questions, but this is very similar along the same thread of what type of lime would you suggest using? Oh,
you definitely want to use agricultural lime. you don't want to use quick lime that's used like for concrete. That's calcium oxide, which is very hot and very reactive. It would burn your plants. So you want to have, any of the lime products that are sold at your nursery, in the nursery section, like if you go to Home Depot or someplace, one of these big stores, you don't want to go to the construction section. You want to go to the, the nursery section and use the agricultural lime product, and any of them that have an Oregon lime score on them that might be anywhere from 80 to 110 or something like that, are good for your garden. So definitely an agricultural lime. It might be a calcitic lime, or it might be a dolomitic lime. Sometimes you might see something that says it's dolomitic lime, and that just means it has magnesium containing compounds and as well as calcium. But that's what you do.
And does sweet lime, does that sound correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, it's probably some people call adjusting the pH of the soil to raise the pH sweetening the soil. That's kind of a historical term that's been used. So it's, yes. But what you don't want to use is the construction lime.
Perfect. All right.
Yeah.
And Dennis, do you recommend testing soil for lead?
You know, if you're unsure, yes. If you're not sure, any houses that are older than I forget what the year is, the 1970s, some period in the, I believe it was the early 80s or late 70s, I've forgotten the exact date, lead-based paint was banned. But even if you live in an older house, there's a possibility that you had lead-based paint on your house and it's been scraped over the years and it hasn't been proper, early on it was probably not properly managed. Now there are rules about how that paint is managed. You may have elevated lead, especially in the drip line of your house, but it could also spread out into your yard. Another source of lead, of course, is formerly, until lead was banned from automobiles, there was lead in fuels and car fuels. So if you live near a busy road, historically busy road, you may have elevated lead in your soil from air emissions. And there are other industrial emissions of lead as well, historically, not so much today. So if you have concerns, if you live in an older urban area with an older home near a busy roadway, yeah, I think it's not a bad idea to have it tested. One way you can avoid exposure to lead without testing your soil, and of course, then you'd have to ask somebody to interpret it for you, but you could also use raised beds. If you have concerns, you could go to using raised beds so that your plants are growing in the soil that the history of in your raised bed. That's an option too.
Perfect. Okay. Are we still doing okay on time, Dennis? I don't.
Oh yeah, I'm fine.
Okay. Okay. Perfect. Just wanted to double check. So we have a few more questions here.
Sure.
Switching topics to the seed tape. Do you take the seeds out of the toilet paper when planting, or just plant as it is?
Oh, you plant it as is. So you take that, you have all the seeds in the seed tape, and so you have this 5-foot long strip of paper and seeds, and then you make a little trench, however deep it's supposed to be for the particular seed you're planting. You lay the seed in there, and then you cover the seed and all. And toilet paper is designed to dissolve. It's designed because it goes through the wastewater treatment system, and it's designed, it just completely falls apart when it gets wet. So when you put it in the ground and you water it in, that toilet paper will completely dissolve and the seeds will grow right through it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So this one says, I'm struggling with carrot germination. What technique do you recommend in our area?
The technique called patience. I don't know. it's I don't want to be flip on that, but it's just really, carrots are frustrating. I'll tell you one solution I did last year, and I actually was pleased with it. Carrots often take a long time to germinate. And because of that, you also need to be very careful to keep them uniformly watered during the germination process so that they don't dry out and get, maybe you got a little germinated, or some of them were germinated and then they dried out and those died, and then some other ones came up. So one solution that I had that actually worked really well last year was actually a two-pronged approach. One was I took my carrot seeds and I actually planted them, I looked at this recently. I planted them like the last week in May, or like the 20th of May, something like that. And instead of planting them in a nice, neat little row, I took a package of carrots and I scattered them in a plot that was about 18 inches by 5 feet. My garden is about 5 or 6 feet wide, and then I just plant rows across that length. And in this case, I said, I'm just going to take this package of carrot seeds and sprinkle them, broadcasting, not in rows, just sprinkle them across that whole area. I'm not sure how well they're going to come up. It's always difficult to tell. And then I covered them with row cover cloth. So you can get this transparent or translucent row cover crop that people use for pest control. And I just laid that over the area that I'd planted my carrot seeds. So I broadcast my carrot seeds on the surface, I raked them in, then I covered them with this row cover, and then I watered them through that. And the row cover actually helped keep the soil more moist on top. And it worked really well. My carrot seeds all came up. I actually was thinking, well, if I don't get many seeds that come up, I'll just harvest them as is. If everything comes up, I'll just thin them. And so what happened was they all came up. They all came up. It took them 2 weeks to come up, but they did all come up. So by the end of the first week in June or something, they were all up, little plants, and they were growing underneath. I left them underneath that shade cloth, or sorry, not the shade cloth, that row cover, for probably 2 months at least, I think, until they got really well established. And that seemed to work really well. And then about in mid-August to late August, I think it was maybe late August, I started harvesting the biggest of the carrots that were in there that were maybe 2 or 3 inches long and thinning them out. So I got, I used a row cover to keep the soil moist, to keep pests off for the first several months. And then I started harvesting the smallest carrots to thin them out so that by the end of the fall, I just had a few, more widely spaced carrots. And I actually used those as a winter crop. I harvested those carrots finally. The last harvest of those carrots was, let's see, we are now the 1st of March, I think about the 15th of February. So I leave my carrots in the garden. And by the end of the winter, they hadn't grown very much more after December, January, but it's a great way to store the carrots because they do fine in the ground. And so I just left them in the ground and harvested probably 6 to 8 inch carrots, some as big as 6 to 8 inches in the middle of February. Yeah, the beginning to middle of February. So probably from late October to February, I had full-sized carrots, and some of them I just left in the garden because that was a great way to store them. But that's so. Have patience. It takes a while for carrots to grow. Try using some row cover to keep the soil uniformly moist on top, and do pay attention to that, and then see what happens.
All right, perfect. So now we have some questions about container and raised beds. How would you rotate in a small raised bed?
Let's see. How would I grow?
Just rotate. How would you rotate in a small raised
Oh,
bed?
in a small raised bed.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, if you have a small raised bed, you might just your rotation might be different crops in different years. So it's a little harder to do. Depends on how small your raised beds are. If you garden at a community garden, there's often 4 feet by 10 feet or 5 feet by, well, yeah, it's usually 4 feet, 4 feet by 10 feet or 12 feet. You could rotate from one end to the other, tomatoes at one end one year, the other end the next year. You could also take tomatoes out. I know it's hard to do, but you could take tomatoes out one year. And there's certain other diseases, and I'll have to refer you to some OSU publications about crop rotation because I don't have them all in my head. But look at what plants have similar diseases and what plants are recommended for rotations and try to rotate those out. So you could have maybe green beans one year followed by squash another year. You could do then followed by, say, lettuces or kale, followed by tomatoes, and you could rotate those in different parts, or you could eliminate those plants altogether. Like you could eliminate tomatoes one year and just go with green beans or something that year and grow your tomatoes somewhere else. or buy them at the store. So, try to rotate them within the plot if you can, which should help a little bit, although you're in a confined space, so you're not going to be as successful as if you have a bigger space to rotate them out, or take them out of the rotation entirely to avoid those problems. The other option would be to clean out your, if it's a very small raised bed or a small pot, if you're growing things in pot, don't reuse the soil from year to year, but start with fresh soil every year and clean out your pot between years. People who maybe garden on patios can do that. Use your soil for a couple of years, but then rotate it out and get fresh soil that way. And clean the pot thoroughly too, because the organisms cling to the side of the pot. And if you don't clean the pot, they can reinfect your clean soil. So that's something you do if you're growing in pots.
Awesome, thank you. So this is a related question kind of if you are gardening in a container and you plant sweet peas and then tomatoes and then lettuce, does that count as rotation?
Well, if that's seasonal, let's say you've got sweet peas really, I don't know if this person is, we'll talk about two instances. So if you're talking about year to year, so you grow sweet peas one year, then the next year you grow tomatoes, and then you grow lettuce, yes, that would constitute a rotation because you've got 2 years in between tomatoes of crops that aren't susceptible to the same thing. If you're talking about growing sweet peas, starting them in the spring, because sweet peas usually grow fairly early, and then transitioning to tomatoes, and then transitioning to lettuce in the fall, and then repeating the next year, but doing tomatoes again, then you're not really rotating. You're doing tomatoes every year again in that same pot. So if it's in a pot, I would say you maybe could do 2 years with tomatoes in the same pot before replacing the soil, but I would, after 2 years, definitely replace the soil. And it's probably best to do it every year because a lot of the soils that you get for pots are very high in organic matter, and a lot of that decomposes over time, and the soil tends to settle in anyway, so you'll have to do some amendment to that soil. So that's just something to consider. I wouldn't go more than 2 years with tomatoes in the same pot before you clean the soil and then clean out the pot really well.
Okay, next up is if you are starting with starts, is there anything you put around them in the raised bed to stunt the growth of weeds?
I don't actually. You could use mulches. For my tomatoes, I put straw mulch around them to suppress weeds and also to keep the soil moisture uniform during the summer. So you could use mulches around your plants a little to protect them. But if you've cleaned all the weeds off and you plant transplants, you're probably, your transplants are going to start to grow pretty quickly before your weeds get very big. So you should be able to keep your weeds under control. Just going to the mulch and tomatoes, that's one crop I do mulch. And I do that primarily both to keep the weeds down and also to keep the soil moisture uniform during really hot, dry weather. One of the problems we have here in, many places, when you get hot, dry weather, there's a physiological disorder called blossom end rot, which is technically a calcium deficiency. But what happens is if the plant gets stressed because it's hot and dry, it doesn't adequately transport calcium to the fruit, and you get these blackened areas on the end of your tomatoes. So using a mulch is a good idea around your tomatoes to keep the soil moist, and the plants don't get as stressed. So in hot weather, really watch that watering. So, but for weed control with transplants, I really don't do too much for them because the transplants are at an advantage over the weeds, and I just kind of go through as the transplants go and knock down the weeds, maybe with a little light tilling.
All right, we have 3 more questions, Dennis.
Sure.
Let me know if we hit time on your end.
Oh, no, that's fine. I usually allot like a half hour. We can go to 11:30 if it's okay with you.
Yes, I am good. So this one is from Facebook Live. It is there an easy way to know how much sun a given area has before the full growing season?
An easy way. Well, observation. I mean, you know, you have tall buildings either to the east or the west. That's of course going to restrict it, or tall buildings to the south. I mean, those are your biggest restrictions. If you have a tall building on the north, it's not going to be too much of a problem. Although, you know, our sun does get around quite far to the north late in the day, but that's not as effective photosynthetically anyway. You know, I don't have any sort of thing other than to say, just, you know, kind of I watch my yard, and I've made changes over the years. You know, my yard evolves, especially with regards to ornamental, as some of the trees and shrubs get bigger, and obviously the buildings haven't changed too much. Well, I shouldn't say that, because like many places in Portland, there's infill going on around me. And a couple of years after well, 5 or 10 years after I bought my house, an apartment building was built next door to me to the west. So it changed the sun dynamics in my yard. And so one part of my garden where I used to grow vegetables, I've now switched over to ornamentals because it's not quite getting enough sunlight anymore. It was okay for growing greens in the past, but now with the additional shade of the building, it's not too good for that, but a lot of ornamentals will grow there instead. So I think the key is just observing how the sun moves through the year, and assume if you've got tall buildings to the east or west or south, you're going to get shade in that part of the yard in the year, and try to plant, you know, in areas that get the most sun as the sun, you know, moves across the sky.
Okay, next up, it says my raised beds are about 10 years old. Each year I add more planting soil and manure. Should I do anything else? They lose a couple of inches each year. Also, is it okay to hand turn down a foot or so each year?
Yeah, that's good. Adding compost or adding other materials back, because the reason it's going down, you're not losing any sand, silt, or clay. None of the inorganic components are really going away. What's going away is the organic matter that was in there before. You may have bought, you know, I don't know what they were filled with initially, but they may have been filled with some commercial mix or something that was had a substantial amount of organic matter in it. And so over time, that organic matter gets used up and decomposes, turns to CO2 and water. And so you lose some of that, and so your soil settles down. It also just gets compacted over time. And so, yeah, it's great that you're adding, you know, compost and a manure, well composted manure from a reliable source, by the way. Commercial sources are best. There are some cautions with manure. You want to make sure it comes from a reliable source that's been tested, that it doesn't have any pesticide residues in it, because there are some long-term issues with that. So what was the other component about? Was about turning the garden? Was that the question?
Yeah. Is it okay to hand turn down a foot or so each year?
Hand turn down. Yes. Yeah. In fact, that's probably a good idea, because over time your soil might get a little compacted, and especially if you're adding in new material every year, just kind of mix up the stuff that's settled down to the bottom. Because over time, if you know, your heavier components are going to work their way down to the bottom. Your inorganic components are going to work their way to the bottom if you just keep adding stuff on top. So yeah, giving it a good turn every year kind of opens it up, and it's a good idea probably.
Okay, and this one's about when you're clearing out your small raised beds or your pots, can you put in the compost the soil that you're removing from your pots or your small raised beds? So I think that means like the compost containers at your home, curbside. Yeah.
You know, my caution with that is most compost bins that homeowners have don't get to a hot enough temperature to kill pathogens, soil-borne pathogens. You need to get up to around 160 degrees, really, really hot in the center, 140 to 160 degrees in the center. Most compost bins at home don't get that. Also, if you're adding potting soil, it's fairly degraded organic matter already. So when you add if you have a compost bin, you want to add browns or greens. You know, you want to have your ratio good for your browns to your greens, your things that are going to break down and heat up the bin, or your green compounds, and then your things like leaves and stuff to sort of moderate that. You know, coffee grounds are another great source of what we call green because they have nitrogen in them and they help heat up the thing. But the old soil doesn't really do much for your compost bin. It doesn't really address those, components of a good compost bin, which is, fresh organic matter or brown organic matter that then gets broken down and into good compost at a high temperature to reduce pathogens. So I generally would not recommend doing that.
Okay, and here is the last question that we have for today is how would you mix sand, silt, and organic compost for your raised bed? Like, is there a good ratio that you would use?
Let's see. It's really difficult to say. I don't have a good ratio for that. Trying to think, I gave a talk a while back, but it wasn't for specifically that. To make your own. I would maybe, I don't have a good answer for that. So I'm gonna pass on that and recommend that the person go to some of the OSU publications on that to see what the specifics are on that. Generally a good compost, we say in the soil, the organic matter should be maybe 3 to 5%. A lot of people have it up at 6 to 8%. It's a little high when it's up to 10%. So you're shooting for something like that. And then just a good, soil mix. There are some commercial ones available. They're commercial operations that sell soil for, specifically for raised beds in the Portland, Oregon. That's probably really a better way to do it for the homeowner and probably just as cost effective by the time you go out and source the individual materials, unless you have a quarry next to you that you can get the sand and silt and clay from to make the right mixture. Just to buy one that's ready-made, that has a good ratio of silt, clay, and organic matter and sand together. If you want to try it yourself, I'm going to have to just pass on that one, and I recommend that people go to OSU publications or send an email to the Metro Master Gardeners at the website information that I gave, and someone can do some more research for that. I'm just not comfortable answering that off the top of my head.
All right. Well, thank you, Dennis. I appreciate you joining us this morning. As we wrap up, there are some good, useful information and links in the chat that we dropped. So if you do have further questions, in addition to the Master Gardener email, you can also email us at the Fix-It Fair, and we can pass information along to Dennis or get you to the right spot. We also have more resources on our website. I dropped that link there as well. And then we would love to hear from you. We have just a closing survey. It enters you into a raffle. So please just let us know if there's things that you loved, things that we didn't address, or that you would like to see in the future. We want to hear from you. And then Marcia was so kind enough, thank you, Marcia, to drop the link that we have on Saturday, March 19th. We have an Ask a Gardener, so please join us then. That's also through the Fix-It Fair, and that link is on there as well as on our website. So we would love to see you again on Saturday the 19th. All right, any closing words, Dennis, before we all hop off and go?
That's it. It's always great to be with the Fix-It Fair. I'm looking forward to doing these things in person in the future again.
Yes, yes. Stay tuned to our website for that too. We are always evaluating, and we'll start here in the next couple months scouting out hopefully in-person places for next Fix-It Fair season. But we will always keep you posted on our email and on our website on what that looks like.
Super.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Go out and enjoy your Saturday. I'm excited to start planting some stuff as well, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.